want to thank Father Gerard for inviting me back. Father Gerard and I are good friends. When he was a pastor of Holy Family in Hicksville, I was there on pastoral years, so we had a year together. Actually, I'm a deacon now, but it was actually at the beginning of the pandemic, which is a long time ago now, but he's become a good friend since then. But unfortunately, I'm going to begin the homily by saying something that we disagree about. And that's that I went camping once with a friend, and I would not recommend it to anybody. Father Gerard is an avid camper. He does that with the Boy Scouts all the time, but I wouldn't recommend it. And here's why. I like hiking. I do, but I like to go home afterwards. And I know afterwards, after Mass today, maybe somebody here will try to convince me why hiking is so great. And I will disagree with you, obviously, but I don't know, I feel like camping is kind of like pretending, like you go and live outside, you're kind of outside of reality when you could really just go home. But I admit that the experience of camping, which I did the one time for one night, there's a great sense of community when you're all outside together. There's a really great bonding there with the people that you're camping with. Probably because you're taking your life into your hands because they warn you about bears, but that's all the... Yeah. But camping is interesting because you're living in a tent and it's temporary. And I was thinking of this yesterday because we had our gospel about the Transfiguration. That life is kind of like camping, and here's why I think that. It's interesting that Peter suggests building 3 tents for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. And why does he suggest that? Well, the gospel is kind of clear. He wants to hold onto the transfigured glory of Jesus. He wants to hold on to it forever in a tent, in something that's temporary, that's not supposed to be forever. It's why the gospel writer says he didn't know what he was saying. He wasn't really getting it, trying to take something eternal and make it of this earth, make it temporary. And Peter and the whole community that's with him, with James and John, the apostles that are there as a community, they're trying their best to have the glory now without the suffering to come, right? Because Peter suggests building the tents right after Jesus says that he has to suffer, that the cross is going to come. And they think, we don't need that because we have the glory right here present before us. Why do we need to suffer at all? Why not just stay here on this mountain? He tries to hold on to fleeting glory in a temporary way. And Jesus knows that it's fleeting, because true victory, true glory only comes through suffering. We only get the resurrection through the cross. That's why we have these 40 days of Lent. And it's interesting that the gospel doesn't just call it Jesus' passion, doesn't just talk about Jerusalem, but it calls it his exodus. When we think of the exodus, our minds go immediately to the Israelites in the desert. They're 40 years in the desert. The 40 years that actually our time of Lent reflects in the 40 days, that we're on the same Exodus now. And what's interesting about the Exodus is that it's completely a temporary existence, those 40 years. They're living in tents in the wilderness. Even God himself in the Ark of the Covenant is dwelling in a tent. And where is the real permanent home? It's the Promised Land. The Exodus is the journey to the Promised Land, to their common home, where they're really supposed to be, what's permanent. And what does it require of Israel? It requires 40 years in the desert. It requires all of Israel in a communal sacrifice, suffering together. Suffering is communal, but it's also temporary. And like camping, it's only miserable for a night. It'll be over soon. But you're united in that experience, a temporary experience, but one that's very communal. And this is something that we miss in that. Because it's temporary and experienced by everybody, it also unites us in hope. We all have the same goal. We focus so much on the sacrifice that we miss the hope, what's to come. I think it's something that we forgot during the pandemic. We all had the same suffering. We complained a lot about the suffering, but we all had the same hope, too. We all knew that it was temporary, that it would be over. One future glory. It's what Peter gets wrong during the Transfiguration, trying to focus so much on the present and not on the future. He wants the glory before the suffering, and because of that, he forgets to hope. He forgets Jesus. And we know as Catholics that what is our only hope? What is this season of Lent about? The cross is our only hope. The cross is our only way to heaven for all of us. All of us have the same cross that unites us. All of us look to the same Christ. And we might ask, why the cross? Why do we have to suffer in order to attain glory? Why does Peter have to wait until later on, after the cross, in order to experience what Christ's transfiguration is trying to tell him? Well, it's a very complicated question, but it's also one that can be explained kind of simply. When sin and death entered the world through the fall, everything in this world became touched in some way by suffering and pain. Everything. There was no longer anything in life that did not touch suffering. Suffering was the only stuff that God had left that he could bring us glory with. Everything in this world had suffering, and it was the only thing, the stuff, that he could use to bring us to heaven. And so he did. That Christ himself took on the greatest evil so that we didn't have to. He took on the cross so we didn't have to bear it alone. And that's the greatest consolation that keeps us hopeful. It's interesting, in John's Gospel at the very beginning, it says, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us," that Jesus Christ became flesh and dwelt among us. You know, the literal translation of that in Greek is, "The Word became flesh and he built his tent among us." That Christ chose to be alongside us in this temporary experience of suffering, to pitch his tent next to ours so that we wouldn't have to experience it alone. He chose to enter our exodus. That's why they say in the gospel that it's his exodus as well, to journey with us to glory. And so where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us called to do the same thing, to suffer alongside of each other, to build tents next to our neighbors. Because at the root of who we are is a communal people, that we need one another. Nobody is saved as an individual. We're all saved as a community. There's no such thing as a personal sacrifice that's not also a communal sacrifice. There's nothing that I do on my own that I don't also do for others. And so the gospel today says what? The measure with which you measure will in return be measured out to you. Nothing is just me, it's always we. And that's the heart of Christianity. We've seen how a lack of hope in the world, an unwillingness for one person to suffer, could have a huge impact on the world. It could have a huge impact on many people. One person lacking hope affects a community. So if the measure I measure out now, if what I give to Christ and others is fleeting and temporary, if it's focused on the world, then that what I measure out to others will be given to me in return, that all I'll receive in return is temporary glory, things that are passing away, the things that the world offers us. But if what I measure out is hope, if what I measure out to others is hope in the cross, in a future glory, then what I will receive in return is eternal life. And really, we can't settle for anything less. Now, as we approach the Eucharist itself is a foretaste of heaven. It's the hope of future glory for us, and it's a communal meal for all of us to share, a sacrifice that unites us all as one. As we approach the Eucharist with Christ before us, Christ who chooses to pitch his tent next to us, may we always have that glory and that hope before us and help one another along the way.